Today, we're joined by Patrick McGee, New York Times best-selling author of Apple in China, a book that starts as the story of one company's rise in the world's most important manufacturing ecosystem and quickly becomes something much, much bigger. Because Apple is not just a consumer technology company. It has one of the most sophisticated supply chains ever built. And over the last 30 years, Apple trained tens of millions of workers, pushed hundreds of factories to meet impossibly demanding standards, and invested billions of dollars into the machinery, talent, and knowledge that turned China into the center of gravity for global manufacturing. And that story now sits at the heart of one of the biggest questions in the global economy. What happens when supply chains built for efficiency are disrupted by geopolitics? And look, this is not just a story about iPhones. It is a story about industrial policy, economic security, and how nations are prioritizing that security over everything else. In this conversation, Patrick and I will talk about what Apple teaches us about supply chain dependency, why reshoring is far harder than most policymakers want to admit, what the CHIPS Act and Intel reveal about America's new industrial policy era, and why companies like SpaceX may offer a very different model for rebuilding American industrial capacity. Apple helped define the age of globalization. The question now is what happens next? Let's get to it. Patrick, thanks so much for joining us. Your book tells the story of Apple's rise in China, but also something much bigger about how modern technology supply chains are built. For listeners who have not read it or listened to the audiobook, what is the story that you set out to tell, and what did you come to believe it reveals about Apple, China, supply chains, and the global economy?
I would say the story I set out to tell was really quite less ambitious than the story that ended up being told just through the research. So, from the get-go, the book was originally called Power Couple, How China and Apple Built a Manufacturing Empire. And I say that just because I did have some inkling that they really had built something big together. But it was a solid 7 months into being on book leave that I began to slowly grasp just what a nation-building effort Apple had in China. And I sometimes hesitate to say that sort of straight off the bat, right, with a new audience, because that sounds a little bit insane. But I don't think anybody's actually got through the 400 pages and then thought he's overstating it. The amount of people that Apple trained in China is 30 million. If people have read the book, it's 28 million, but that's because it's gone up 2 million since the book was published, right? They have about 2.5 million new people in the Chinese supply chain alone every year. And that's because there's just incredible churn. And then the investments they were making, we're talking billions upon billions of dollars each year just on machinery. And you're talking about a 25-year effort. So when you add it up, especially with the training costs of all the workers, you're getting to just astronomical sums where, a single year, Apple will spend more in China. I should say invest more in China than the CHIPS Act, which is like the flagship, act of bringing semiconductors back to America under Biden, spent over 4 years. So the sums involved are just extraordinary. And I would say the sums are actually the most accessible point of understanding Apple's significance in China, but probably the least important. It was more the cultural detail of just how demanding Apple executives and managers were in working in quite literally hundreds of factories across the country and getting people up to speed, getting people up to Apple quality, and doing so at a ruthless way where they were barely making any money, if they were making any money at all. But then Apple was telling them, hey, don't worry, go use these skills on someone where you can make money. And that was sort of the quid pro quo. So in a nutshell, that's sort of the book. But of course, that's a 45-second answer. And I'm trying to condense what's really a 30-year narrative.
We had Chris Miller from Chipwar come on the show earlier this year, and he highlighted just how complex the chip semiconductor supply chains are. And I don't know if there's a more complicated supply chain in the world than what Apple's created around the world, and not just in China. But from your perspective and researching the supply chain more than anybody, what does it say when a company like Apple became so deeply dependent on that ecosystem that now is subject to a lot of geopolitical fault lines?
I think the overall narrative is one of Western companies, but Apple in particular, being lured into China. And they were lured there because they have a tendency to think through profits as the lens in which a good decision is either good or bad. And so if that's your lens, then moving everything to China over the last 30 years has been absolutely brilliant. I mean, you think of the world's most valuable companies, NVIDIA and Apple. These are companies that are very dependent on what gets called the smiley curve of product development, where essentially the Western corporation does what Nike did in the 70s, which was, why don't we focus just on product inception and design, and we'll outsource all the manufacturing and logistics to some other nation, right? For NVIDIA, that's TSMC in Taiwan, but for Apple, that's largely China. And for Nike, for what it's worth, that's Vietnam, Indonesia, China, etc. And there's something brilliant about that in terms of returns for shareholders. But what I worry about, and where I think Apple is really quite entangled at the moment, is we've given away just such wide swaths of like tacit knowledge of how do you actually get this stuff done, to such a degree that we've literally forgotten how to do it ourselves. And given this major capacity to what has become, through no fault of Apple's, the biggest geopolitical adversary to the United States. So that's where like a standard corporate history of Apple all of a sudden became wildly geopolitical, because you're sort of recognizing that what Western companies did, and Apple's just sort of par excellence, the example here, but by no means unique at least in a certain respect, is they traded profits for state capacity, state knowledge. And so by giving it up to sort of a foreign adversary, you could really look back at the last 3 decades and think, oh my God, that was like a major, major mistake. Because if for some reason you all of a sudden had to build 230 million iPhones in America next year, there's just no chance it could be done. I mean, we're talking a 10-year effort, and it probably wouldn't even get to the same cost or capacity that China has today. So yeah, profits versus capacity. I think to some extent that's the major tension underlying the book.
Apple, in some ways, is that canary in the coal mine situation with the tech industry. But if you look back over the last 5, 6, 7 years, there's been all sorts of supply chain restrictions that have led to other industry verticals that aren't as high tech moving to a China plus one strategy, where, for example, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which is a blanket prohibition on all products coming from China into the United States that are made with forced labor. I mean, billions and billions of dollars worth of goods have been detained at the U.S. border for violations of this law. And so as a result, a lot of the initial enforcement for that volume was targeting retailers, clothing companies. And so those clothing companies that had established decades-long production manufacturing facilities and supply chains in China relocated to another country, where over the course of 8 quarters, 12 quarters, whatever the case may be, is they shifted some of that production from China to Southeast Asia or elsewhere. And that took retail brands, clothing companies, people that are making pants and t-shirts and tennis shoes. That took years to do. So what you're talking about when it comes to reshoring a technology supply chain like that, we're talking, is 5 years, 10 years even reasonable?
I mean, China basically took 4 decades to get to where it is now. And so you would be optimistic to say that India could do it in 4 decades, right? Because what you're assuming is that the level of achievement that China took is somehow the textbook example that anybody else could follow. But the reality is that Beijing and local governors in places like, local political cadres in places like Shenzhen, Hangzhou, Chengdu, etc. I mean, they made manufacturing like the Nietzschean will to power. This is how China is going to get on the world stage. And it's hard to be the next China when the current China still is there. You know what I mean? Like, it's really difficult to compete against China. But when you were China, you didn't have someone else, right? Like, in other words, China was the only country with more than 1 billion people in it that was making manufacturing their be all end all. This is how we're going to achieve world-class status as a nation. India, you might look at that and say, well, don't they have the potential to do that? Yeah, maybe, but they don't have the will to power. That's just not how Narendra Modi sees the country. He might talk about manufacturing now and again, but for China, that was sort of all they talked about. I mean, it really is where all the resources went, and they just lured in, beginning in the late 70s, the Chinese diaspora, beginning with Hong Kong, moving over to Taiwan, begins to invest in 1988, and then eventually Japan, and then eventually the West writ large. it would be very difficult for someone to play that playbook again, in particular because not only, as I said, China is still doing it, but we're also entering a new stage where labor intensity is probably not at its peak anymore. Automation is. And so it's harder to sort of copy and paste what China has already achieved. So, I don't want to be too bearish about this, but 40 years is probably a low estimate of what it would take for someone like India to really replicate inch for inch what China's been able to do.
And it's not only just the manufacturing processes, it's the technical know-how. And I am reminded of this every week in the news where a news story about intellectual property transfer or illicit technology transfer occurs between a high-tech industry and China. It happens all the time. And so as a result of that decades-long approach to illicit technology transfer or just technology transfer that's legal and required in exchange for foreign companies to gain access to the Chinese market, that is continuing to happen. And I don't see a world where Vietnam or Malaysia or Indonesia could force a Western brand to necessarily do that. So to your point, I just don't see that happening in the near term. But I do want to talk about, though, U.S. statecraft, because even though it may take a bit of time, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years to reshore some of these supply chains, we have to at least think about these problems right now. The CHIPS Act, as you mentioned, did some of this in a bite-sized perspective, but the Trump administration is taking a different approach to some of this, including stakes in companies, equity stakes in companies that are involved in these emerging and critical technologies. So Apple shows us how a company can become dependent on an industrial ecosystem, but what happens when the United States decides to bring some of that capacity back? Do we have to explore some of the statecraft like national champions and other things? How do we do that?
I would say it's partly above my pay grade to sort of like play the role of consultant and lay out exactly how we should be thinking about that. But in the broadest sense, there's no question that we need to be studying what China was able to achieve with industrial policy and then really demarcate what we're able to replicate, what we're able to also do, and what we're just never going to compete on. And I say that because, again, China has something like, 4 times the population of America, and they have more than 300 million migrant laborers. In other words, within the country, you have people that are floating around, that's the term that they use in China, kind of from one factory to another, often working odd jobs for 12 weeks, 16 weeks, etc. A lot of the people in the iPhone assembly line aren't building iPhones all year long, right? Apple doesn't sort of need production of iPhones all year long. The production is spiky rather than smooth. A new iPhone comes out and all of a sudden they need absolutely just tremendous amounts of people in the workforce, but only for 16 weeks or so, right? So the people that are working there are there temporarily. If you were to set up a similar type facility or a similar type industrial cluster in, Arizona or something, we just don't have the population density to support it. And you wouldn't frankly want, a state-driven bus system to go take migrants out of other places in America or Mexico or Honduras or something to go fill the factories for some period of time. Treating people as second-class citizens in their own country just is not the American way. It's not something we're going to replicate, and so we need to give up certain fantasies I think sometimes people have of like reshoring everything to America. I think we're much better off relying on our allies for much of the needs, but I do cheerlead sort of every effort I see of building things in America. One thing I would point out that it's true that China, provides subsidies and all sorts of things, for local production. It used to be multinationals. More and more increasingly, it's the red supply chain. That's sort of the Taiwanese term for mainland homegrown giants. And I do think we have to do something along those lines. So I would say I'm actually a pretty wild supporter of the Trump administration taking 10% of Intel. Intel is too big to fail. There is no company in America, I can just say this as a blanket statement, that is capable of competing with TSMC. The only two in the world are Samsung and Intel. Intel is too important to fail. And so that sort of move to put 10% of American money into Intel was basically a way of stopping the short sellers from circling the company. And in a wink, wink kind of nudgy way, it forced, I think, the hand of NVIDIA, Apple, possibly even Elon Musk to begin taking Intel seriously as part of their TSMC +1 strategy. That was a wholly necessary move. And you can be a purist on, free markets and think that was a calamity or something, but But if you can be a purist and have Intel die, or you can give up some of your ideals and have Intel live. I think the option B is far better.
Josh Lipsky from the Atlantic Council, who leads their geoeconomic program, made this comment recently where he said it's standard practice in South Korea or Taiwan to have industrial policy, and choosing companies that are too big to fail. It's just natural. It has been for decades. But as we think about this new reshoring mechanism that's happening in the policy making community and certainly in the corporate world as well, I see more of that. I see more of the examples where not just the Trump administration, but any future administration takes an equity or a control or an ownership stake in some way, shape, or form into those critical and emerging technologies. Not just the companies that are too big to fail that are already out there, but those companies that are just starting, the critical mineral mines that need a decade and guaranteed offtake, rates. All of those types of companies will need that level of industrial policy. And I also think about future too big to fail companies. And you've written quite a lot about SpaceX. When we think about SpaceX as an enterprise, they're trying to do a lot of that full stack, full vertical integration, everything from the chips to the data centers, theoretically, and space and the rockets that can take them there. What does the SpaceX story tell you about the global economy and global supply chains and reshoring that's different than what you've learned with Apple and Intel?
It's funny, if you didn't have Tesla and SpaceX, it would be hard to be optimistic about American reindustrialization. You'd say, like, what examples do we have where, a company in America is in the major leagues in terms of production? And the fact that Elon is behind both companies, like, he's got polarizing politics or whatever, but like, you have to get over that if you don't like him and just be cognizant of how remarkable it is that what's now a $2 trillion company. I mean, I guess the valuation's a little sort of like neither here nor there in terms of its achievement. But I mean, SpaceX has launched more satellites into orbit than the rest of the world combined since we began sending anything into orbit, whatever it was, 7 decades ago. I mean, there's something absolutely remarkable about that. And Tesla is the company that altered the trajectory of every other car company on the planet towards electric vehicles. I mean, I used to be the Financial Times Frankfurt correspondent. I've never been to a car show where Tesla is actually present. And I think Tesla has nevertheless been the most important car maker at every car show I've been to. Right. It's like ghost-like presence is fundamental to every car show that you could possibly attend. So the fact that those examples are in America, although Tesla has, of course, branched off to Germany and China, I think is sort of reinvigorating all sorts of people. I mean, there's this chart floating around the internet that counts more than 80 companies where the people have gone from SpaceX and Tesla to found other companies, right? Doing all kinds of things. I won't sort of give the list of the ones that I can remember off the top of my head, but it's really quite remarkable. And I think the idea that they're learning those skills and then founding other companies, it's actually the mirror image to what happened in China, where Apple had this huge investment with America's best engineers going over and training. And frankly, Apple did spawn these industrial clusters. It did spawn local entrepreneurship. But of course, they were on the Chinese side of the sketch rather than ours. And so in a sense, SpaceX probably has the world's best engineers. I mean, if you're up for an engineering challenge coming out of MIT or Caltech, there's no better company that you would want to go to. And so for them to sort of spend 5 or 10 years at SpaceX and then found another company in America, it's absolutely remarkable. And the only reason SpaceX would be able to do it, aside from maybe just like Elon's unique character, is that that's an industry that you cannot outsource, right? Whether it's like just the weight of the rocket ships and all that kind of stuff, but more particularly the fact that if it's going into space, it's working with the Air Force and the Space Force and government entities in general. You're not going to outsource that stuff to China. You can't. So like necessity is the mother of invention. You're able to build in America. I think those examples are just absolutely remarkable.
It reminds me, though, of this concept where you have SpaceX, a company who's focused on expanding the human race to Mars, but they're still tethered back to supply chains here on Earth. And the story about Apple chips, right? All of this is interconnected. So SpaceX may have to have that requirement for national security to get these things up into orbit. But there's still fragility within these supply chains. The chips are still probably made by TSMC or somewhere else, right? That's not the United States. All of those choke points that exist for rockets or the batteries, for example, that go into EVs, many of them are made in China still because of that industrial policy. So we have these, I'm not going to call them national champions, but we have American companies like Tesla and SpaceX and others where we still have these dependencies. Intel could be a global competitor for TSMC, even more so than they already are, but there's still choke points within their technology. We still need ASML, for example, in the chip space. We still need all of these foreign raw materials like rare earth magnets and critical minerals that we just don't have domestically. And so, as you're thinking about the through line for these companies, what else jumps out to you? Is there anything else that that we should be thinking about from a corporate perspective, from a policy perspective? How do we counter adversaries that are investing far, far, far more into their companies than the U.S. government is? What are we missing here?
You know, like it's true, and you can use the language of dependencies on other nations or dependencies on the Netherlands for machines from ASML. But those are allied countries that we should be trading with. Like I think Pax Americana, the idea of an American-led global order with basically tariff-free trade with other nations, is the best possible order you could think of in a certain sense, right? So I want to see like a NAFTA on steroids. I want to see more trade with Canada and Mexico and with the Southern Hemisphere. It doesn't bother me in the slightest that we're dependent on TSMC, for the exception that China doesn't accept Taiwan as an actual country, and frankly, because China doesn't, nor does the United Nations, right? And nor do most countries. They really can't accept them, otherwise they risk China's ire. But generally speaking, yes, there's some fragility in the supply chain globally because of these various choke points, but it's also a system that absolutely thrives. And I mean, yeah, it'd be great if we could have a company rival ASML, but I mean, that's just really difficult. That's just sort of the order of a Darwinian, corporate system on a global scale. So the dependencies that I worry about are those with China. And it's just because China has a totally different stated interest, right? They don't want to be part of a Pax Americana. They see China, and you don't have to be a China hawk to sort of recognize the threat here. They see China as sort of its own order. They're the Middle Kingdom, and they basically want to sever their dependence on the world, and they want to increase the dependence of the world on China. Whatever one thinks of their ambitions and so forth, or their capabilities of doing so, that's not sort of a happy-go-lucky system, trading partner that you want to be a part of. So I don't think that companies like Apple need to sort of like hurry to the exits or something, but they need a plan B, and it's pretty remarkable for a multi-trillion-dollar company essentially not to have a plan B. Like if TSMC, for whatever reason, stops producing, NVIDIA and Apple have literally zero way to continue producing any chips that they've been producing over the last 5 or 6 years. That's pretty remarkable. Like our dependence on Taiwan is absolutely extreme. And then China is, of course, a home to basically everything that's going on in the supply chain for Apple outside of chips as well. And when people talk about their supply chain emergence in India, like that's a really embryonic, still dependent on China trading partner. The reality doesn't match the hype that you might find in some of the Apple blogs and so forth. So, if my book has in any way been a catalyst for Apple to sort of put more investments into India, that would be amazing. But it's hard to be too optimistic, because even if Apple had a magic wand to replicate inch for inch everything that China has, they wouldn't use the magic wand. And the question of why is that they have a $70 billion business. $70 billion. I mean, this is way bigger than anybody else in terms of China revenue in any other corporation. They don't want to be seen as the poster child for decoupling to their Chinese consumers, let alone the local politicians, let alone the federal government. And so that's why I argue that Apple is captured. If there's any optimism here, it's not to do with Apple. It's the fact that Apple is far more sophisticated and operating at a level of volume that virtually nobody else is competing with. So it's just not the same if we're looking at really any other industry, whether it's pharmaceuticals or rare earth metals or something like that. There are a lot more options for companies operating in those domains than Apple has operating in smartphones.
Exactly. And I also like to point out that we should, as an American or as the West, we want our brands to succeed globally. I want iPhones to be in the hands of everyone. I don't want necessarily, or Google phones, whatever. I don't want everybody to be using Huawei phones for all sorts of security reasons. So there is a natural tension that exists between developing and sustaining and growing a go-to-market presence in the region, or in China in particular, and walking that fine line, a knife's edge really on the geopolitics. What do you advise companies right now that are going through similar challenges with China or China plus one? What would you tell a CEO if they were to ask you the next couple of years, what do you see is going to happen?
So the thing is, I think it's totally dependent on what industry they're in, right? Because if it's a dual use technology, then absolutely they can't be dependent on China, just because if, there's a blockade of Taiwan, or for some reason, China becomes the next Russia, wherein, basically every corporation in a matter of a week or two sort of had to cut their ties, then you're not going to want to be thinking of a plan B for the first time then. But there's other companies that are dependent on China, and it's not dual use. And I don't know that it's particularly concerning. It's not to say that you should therefore put all your eggs in one basket. Like, that's just a bad strategy in any event. But I think the advice would be wildly different depending on what industry we're talking about. I've been informed by people in biotech that when they read the book, they have this like, oh shit moment where they're like, the biotech industry is kind of where Apple was around 2009, 2010. And so we read your book and we're like, oh, like we need to stop looking this on the spreadsheets, because when we do that, it's like everything's swimmingly easy to do in China. But if we sort of fast forward 15 years hence, like, oh, we're going to have complete dependence, and that's not a good thing. So, that's not an industry I know very well. For all I know, everything I just said was wrong. But like, that's what people have told me. And so I love that they can draw their own sort of expertise, couple it with what the lessons are in my book, and sort of come up with a better answer there. Yeah, but pharmaceuticals versus electric vehicles, you're going to have a totally different answer.
Totally fair. Well, it's been awesome having you on. We always end with one question, which is, you're an author, obviously, but besides your book, what's your favorite book that you've read recently?
Oh, God, I'm going to have trouble just not naming like 6 or 7 books.
Go for it.
Well, you know what? I'll just name 2 by the same author, and I'm probably butchering the pronunciation of his name, but it's Benjamin Lapetute. And his books were written in Spanish. He's Chilean. And in English, they're called The Maniac. I got to say, a title I didn't love until I realized it's an acronym for a computer that was made by John von Neumann. He basically makes the argument that John von Neumann is the most consequential mind of the 20th century. And it's written in a fascinating way where he is not a journalist. He sort of uses the tools of fiction to write nonfiction. And so, chapters are written in the voice of his wife, his lover, his best friend, I think maybe even himself, not the author, but von Neumann. So it's fascinating, and to some extent, it's a sequel to a book called When We Cease to Understand the World. I think that was 2021, and it's sort of on the blurriness between madness and genius. And it's kind of sort of a book on the great figures who came up with quantum mechanics roughly 100 years ago. Absolutely fascinating.
Awesome. Love it. Well, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure to have you on the show. Where can people find you?
Thanks, Kit. I don't know. I guess on X, I'm not all that frequent on there, but Patrick McGee _ is my annoyingly cumbersome username, because some other Patrick McGee had already taken it. But LinkedIn is actually probably the easiest way to find me if one wants to, actually contact me, and I'm more than open to that.
Great. Well, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Kit. Appreciate it.
That was Patrick McGee, New York Times bestselling author of Apple in China. What I find so powerful about Patrick's work is that it forces us to look past the device in our hand and see the industrial system and the supply chain behind it. Apple's story is not just about design or software or the consumer technology that many of us use. It's about the factories, the workers, the machinery, the engineering, and the accumulated know-how that make that modern technology possible. And that is where the economic security lesson really comes into focus. For decades, the West treated manufacturing as something that could be optimized, outsourced, and abstracted away. But Apple's experience shows that production is not just a cost center, it is a source of power. It creates capabilities. It creates and trains workforces. It builds entire ecosystems. And once those ecosystems move overseas, they are very difficult to recreate. Now, of course, that does not mean the answer is that every supply chain has to come back to the United States or an allied country. But it does mean that companies and policymakers need to be much more honest about dependency, resilience, and the difference between efficiency and capacity. The future of industrial policy will not be measured only by subsidies or factory announcements. It will be measured by whether countries like the United States and its allies can rebuild the talent, infrastructure, and technical depth required to compete in the industries and the verticals that matter most. Apple helped define the last era of globalization. Its supply chain may now help define the next era of economic security. In Patrick's book, Apple in China, it's essential reading for anybody trying to understand this. Thanks for joining. I'm Kit Conklin.